Everybody, I'd like to acknowledge the Whadjuk Noongar people, the traditional custodians of the land that we're meeting on today, and to pay not just my respects, but acknowledge the unfinished business and unhealed wounds that continue today and that began with the occupation of this country 231 years ago. Now, we're here today to talk the truth about making a living as a writer in Australia. And one truth is that when you hear about writers' incomes, it's often the breathless reporting of another unknown author getting a 6 or 7 figure advance after a bidding war with all of the major publishing houses. And AJ Betts was here last night in this room accepting the WA Emerging Writers Award as part of the Premier's Book Awards. And she told us that all of her friends think that she is rich because she's an author, so she's just like J.K. Rowling. So is that actually how it works? That's what we're here today to dig into. And AJ did tell us that that $60,000 award that she got after several books have already been published will be for the first time enabling her to write full-time. So here we are with a wonderful panel to talk truth about making a living as a writer. Here with us today, we're joined by Annabel Smith here in the red. She is the author of the interactive novel/app, The Ark, the best-selling Whiskey Charlie Foxtrot, which was a real breakout hit in the United States, and a new map of the universe, which was shortlisted for the WA Premier's Book Awards. She is an Australia Council Creative Australia Fellow. She holds a PhD in writing and she teaches for the Australian Writers Centre. But apart from that big commercial success that she had in the US with Whiskey Charlie, she has made very little from her writing. She survives on teaching and grants and bits and bobs cobbled together, and she has considered becoming a foot model. At the end, we have Maurice Gleitzman, a best-selling Australian children's author. He's written for TV and print media, but he's best known for more than 40 children's books that he's been publishing for over 30 years. How many of us here have come across one of Maurice's books? Okay, how many of you are here because you're really excited to see Maurice Gleitzman? Okay, good, it's really important to calibrate this. Those books have been published in over 20 countries, and clearly you don't need me to tell you about them, but they are just so beautifully confronting serious issues in such funny and unexpected ways. He's won countless awards and accolades. He is the current Australian Children's Laureate, and his books, as we've seen, are everywhere. And Juliet Rogers here on my right was the managing director of Random House New Zealand for 9 years before migrating across the Tasman and becoming MD of Random House Australia. She's also held lots of other senior publishing industry roles before crossing over and becoming the CEO of the Australian Society of Authors. The ASA is the peak body representing authors and illustrators here in Australia, campaigning at industry and government levels for the promotion of their rights. So given that background, when we hear Juliet talk about the truth about making a living as a writer, we know that she really understands all of the realities of the industry. And me, I'm Rebecca Giblin. I am an Australian Research Council Future Fellow. I work on issues relating to copyright and authors' rights, technology regulation and access to knowledge. And I head up an international project studying e-lending in public libraries. And I'm also the head of something called the Authors' Interest Project, which is about how we can take authors' interest more seriously in copyright. So as you can probably guess from all of that, I am a tragic reader, but I am trying to cut down. So if you've got any questions you want to ask the panel, we are going to open up towards the end of the session, and you can also tweet them to me during the panel on Twitter if you use that, @rgibli. So there's RGIBLI. And the hashtag is Disrupted Festival. So let's get cracking. Annabel, I want to start with you. There was a real bombshell report that came out of Macquarie University in 2015 that said the average earnings for an Australian writer from their writings was $12,900 per year. And that was treated in the media and publicly as just a scandalously low figure. What was your reaction?
Bit much.
It's like, wow, that would be great. And yeah, I suppose when you first start out writing, as you say, the only media reports you've ever heard are the books that do astonishingly well. And I mean, it seems ridiculous in hindsight, but after my first book came out, I was devastated that I wasn't an overnight success, because I kind of thought, well, that's just what happens, right? You write a book and then you're like rich and famous. I suppose, you know, after my book had been out for a few years, I started to actually look at how much money I was making and crunch those numbers. And it was after my second book came out, and I was going to a lot of book clubs and chatting to people, and they, like AJ said, often said to me, so do you make a lot of money from your writing? And I was sort of torn between hysterical laughter and hysterical tears at that. And I decided to write a blog post about it. And I crunched my numbers for the end of financial year about how much I'd earned. And I think that first year, I'd maybe earned...
It's about 7,000.
7,000, yeah, it was around 7,000. And I published it on my blog, and it was the only experience I've ever had in my life of something I've posted going viral. And everyone was sharing it on Twitter and talking about it and saying how courageous it was to publish this embarrassingly low figure. And I was like, wow, we really need a lot more conversation about this, because I know so many writers who are making this kind of money, and yet we're all pretending that it's not happening.
And so one of the things you've been doing since then is it's pulling back the curtain, isn't it? You've been breaking the taboos, and you have been continuing to publish information and quite detailed breakdowns about how much you're earning. And there's almost something naughty about reading your posts on that, because it's like you're showing us your knickers.
Yeah.
To break down. Nobody sort of knows this very personal information about us. So can you show us your knickers? Tell us some of the figures and some of that work that you've been doing since, and how it breaks down, what the sources of income are, and what it looks like at the end of the year.
Yeah, so I started to dig into not just how much authors earn, but how they earn it too. So I think a common perception about writers is that they make a lot of money from selling their books, so royalties. And a lot of people don't understand, for example, that a book that sells for $25, the author gets usually 10% of that. So they get $2.50 per book. So you've got to sell quite a lot of books to make money from it. And the Australian book market is not huge. So I started, I suppose, by looking at royalties, and immediately realised that royalties for most authors make up a tiny percentage of their income, and that most authors use a whole range of other ways to earn money. And I'm sure you're very familiar with this, Morris, but public speaking is often a very big part of what authors do, and also teaching and running workshops and that kind of stuff. So I started to just ask people I knew if they would be willing to share actual dollar amounts about their incomes, so that I could publish them and share this information. And it was, I think it was very liberating for people to read this and realise that they weren't alone, because I think that there's this deep shame about making a little amount of money as a writer, and we tend to equate commercial success with creative success. So we think, well, if I'm not making any money out of my writing, I must be a failure, I must be a bad writer. And in fact, as I was talking to Juliet before in the green room, there's so much luck involved in making money as a writer, and you can have two equally wonderful books, and one of them might become a commercial success and one of them won't. And it doesn't make the second book any less of a wonderful book just because it isn't commercially successful. And I think I really realised that people were really hungry for that message, to realise, lots of writers are doing very badly in a commercial sense. I'm not alone in this, and it doesn't mean I'm a bad writer. It's the reality of the market that we're in.
And one of the things we've been seeing in a trend with author earnings surveys that have been coming out throughout the English language world over the last 15 years or so is a decline of earnings, but also a decline in advances. Can you tell people a little bit about advances and what you've learnt about those and what's happening with those through the data that you've been collecting?
Yeah, sure. So an advance is a payment that a publisher makes to a writer when they sign a contract, and it's an advance on future royalties, or what they expect the author to earn from the book. And back in the glory days of publishing, the advance was often what the author lived on while they were writing the book. So they would sign a contract, and then they might earn a big enough advance to, have 6 months or a year where they could live on that money and finish writing the book. And I think I worked out that my advance is just about paid for my chocolate for while I was writing the book.
So how much are we talking? Come on, this is pulling back the curtain.
Yeah, pulling back the curtain. So my advance for my first book was $500 in 2 instalments. So it was $250 on signing the contract and $250 on publication. So I actually blew that all in one night on a dinner at Vue de Monde in Melbourne. And it was the best $500 I've ever spent. So I actually went into debt because I had to wait to get the second $250. What I discovered when I was asking people about their advances is some people are still getting quite good advances. And nowadays a quite good advance might be $10,000. Occasionally you might see someone get $50,000 or $70,000. That's unusual, but it does still happen. But there are a lot of people now getting very, very small advances, and there are many, many people who are being published, especially debut authors with small presses, who are getting no advance whatsoever. So they get nothing upon signing the contract. They have to wait for their royalties.
And one of the interesting things is in the UK, for example, just the proportion of people or authors who have received an advance has dropped from 82% in 2006 to about 69% last year. So we are seeing that $0 advance come up at the same time as we're seeing the overall drop.
And I think, Juliet, you were saying recently, a few years ago, you would have strongly advised any author against signing a contract that didn't come with an advance, but now it's sort of like you have to take what you can get.
Well, to some extent you do, especially with small presses. Cash flow is such an issue, and it's part of the equation, but it's also how well they'll publish the book, how much they know about what you're writing. Those little presses can be really impressive in the way they swing in behind the title. So while we prefer that everybody got an advance, being in the right place with the right publisher is also really important.
So it's really exciting, I think, that we're starting to speak openly about these issues, and particularly in the comments on your web series, Annabel. We see, if you have a look at those comments, so it's annabelsmith.com, you see that there's quite a few authors speaking quite openly there, including names that you may well recognise, like Graham Simpson, for example, who wanted to be with us here today, but unfortunately had to be on a Greek island teaching a writing workshop. So he's devastated not to have been able to make it. But I think, the overwhelming feeling in those comments to me seems to be relief that they're not the only ones. And there was one really poignant comment that I saw where the author said they're going to print this out and take it and show their family to show they're not a failure, or at least everyone's failing together in a similar sort of way. But also in the comments, quite often by different authors, you see the words, "Oh, but of course I don't do it for the money." And my reaction is always, don't tell them that. But to what extent is that a factor for you and the other writers that you know?
Doing it for the money.
No, doing it not for the money.
Doing it not for the money.
Because lots of people are not getting paid, but lots and lots of books are being produced. Is there a paradox there?
I don't know. I suppose you know, the serenity prayer. I put the God part in brackets, but grant me the, what is it? I can't even think of it. The serenity to accept the things I cannot change. So I kind of feel like, well, I can't take on the whole industry. I'm glad you are, but I feel like that's beyond me as an author. So I just have to, you know, accept. Okay, well, I'm not going to make money and just work within that, and rather than, you know, getting really worked up about the fact that, you know, and I know people who have decided if they can't make a living from it, they're not going to do it. And for me, it's something that I just feel like I have to do. I'm not happy if I'm not doing it, and I just have to accept the part where I'm not making much money from it.
All right, so let's move over to Morris, as you've all been waiting for. Now, we need to do a bit of contextualization here, because we've been talking at the beginning with Annabel and about what the financial realities are for most Australian authors. But we have here our Australian J.K. Rowling sitting at the end of the panel.
You wish.
Just to put this in, and we've seen how widely your books have penetrated in this country, just to put things in context, could you just give us a bit of a sense of how many copies your books have sold?
Well, I should preface this by saying, although for those of you who can see me clearly, this is a tautology, but I've been in this business for a very long time. So the sort of the totals, I guess, have to really be divided by about 32 or 33 years of doing it. But and it's because I have books published in about 20 different countries, certainly not all the books in all those countries, and because, as Juliet will know, once license holders, such as my Australian publishers, are putting out ancillary or supplementary licenses through various tiers of agents around the world, it can actually be quite hard to stay in touch with actual, I mean, obviously, in theory, the money filters back to me, but I don't always get a chance to actually see the actual copies. But I think about a few years ago, maybe 5 years ago, there was an attempt to, in the sort of back office, to try and put a figure on how many of my books had sold over the years. And it certainly got up to, 5 or 6 or 7 million sort of thing.
Yeah.
It's amazing. Well done. Incredible.
Divided by 33.
But
Still amazing.
just for some further context, so your typical best-selling independently published Australian book will sell about 7,000 copies, and everybody is rapt. So maybe it's 7 million by now for Morris. So just so that we all know what stratosphere he's operating from. And of course, he's downplaying that backlist by dividing by 33 or 35 or whatever it is. But books depreciate really quickly. And for most books, the commercial life is over within about 5 years. But one of the remarkable things about Morris's body of work is that every single one of his 41 books is still in print. And so Misery Guts, which I read when I was in primary school, is available as an ebook, as a paperback, and as an audio book. Yes, you can divide by 33, but there is something extremely special about having a backlist that has had that kind of cultural longevity. And so that's something that I'd like to understand a little bit more. You're still publishing lots of books, but what's the role of your backlist in terms of your royalties income?
Well,
what role does that play?
Just before I get into some sort of hard figures, there's a couple of things I'd quickly like to add, because when we're looking at the territory of writers and how much they earn and how much they can potentially earn, when you look at, say, a career like mine over 30 years, there are shifts all the time in aspects of the industry that, over and above the basic formula of the more people who want to buy your books, the more you earn, can have quite significant effects. And also the type of books you're writing, the sort of audience you're aiming for. So for all the years I've been writing books, I've only written books for young people, and that has been a very healthy sector in a country that has long been aspirational And part of being an aspirational family is that mum and dad work very hard and possibly don't have much time for reading, but they want books in the house, they want books in their children's lives, so they will spend their disposable book money on books for the kids, which of course is great for people who write books for kids. I was very lucky. I spent the first 10 years of my writing career as a screenwriter, and when I was out of the blue asked to turn one of my screenplays into a book for young people, I did it purely in a spirit of adventure and discovered it was the sort of writing that I've been made for, and I've stuck to that ever since. And that happened to be at a time in the mid-1980s when there was an absolute renaissance, as we all know, and probably more than a renaissance because it became bigger than it ever had, of writing for children in Australia. Teachers suddenly wanted books in the schools that were Australian stories. And that meant that I quickly hit a critical mass of as the marketers say, of awareness and appreciation of my work. And so quite quickly my early books were selling very healthily indeed. And that does help a backlist have a long life when those books have made quite an impact when they first come out. There's been another major shift during these years, and without it, I would not have 40 books still in print. And that is that the printing industry, the business model and the technology has changed dramatically, as I'm sure many of you know. When I started out, even publishers who were cautious or cash flow poor and could only do a fairly small first print run, they knew they had to do at least 2,000 or 3,000, because to print any fewer than that, you would be paying such a high unit cost that the business model didn't work. Things have changed now, and it's possible to print books a few hundred, or even a few dozen, or even, I think, probably one. And the unit cost still makes it viable to sell it and have the necessary profit margins. So many of my backlist books are selling what, in terms of their lifetime sales pattern, are quite small amounts. Some of them are selling under 1,000 copies a year. And that means that, well, I must quickly say the other thing that's changed is that just as print costs have come down a lot, warehousing costs have gone up a lot. And these two things actually are a happy coincidence, because it means that publishers can do frequent reprints of small numbers. And many of my titles are reprinted 400 or 500 books at a time. The warehousing costs are one of the factors that have sadly done terrible damage to what used to be called the B list, or even the C list in a publisher's scheme of things. Those writers who were developing, who were not to be expected to sell tens or hundreds of thousands, they were building a readership and they were building their craft, and as long as they sold a few thousand of their first 5 or 6 books and showing an increase, then the hope was that they would eventually hit a level where they could earn a full-time living from their writing, and it would justify, you know, a healthy amount of money spent on advertising and marketing, and everybody was happy. But it is, in the kids area, incredibly difficult, and I think it's just as difficult writing adult fiction. It's incredibly difficult to break through now and hit that critical mass. I'm a member of a 60-something A-list in children's writing in Australia. There's perhaps 8 or 10 of us, and when we look over our shoulder, not anxiously for the reason of being replaced, anxiously because we know we must be replaced eventually, because I don't have any great hopes of continuing to fulfill my publishing commitments after I'm dead. And we look over our shoulder, and there's not another coterie of 10 or 15 or 20 years younger. There are individuals doing great work, but there's not another group who've all broken through to sort of household name status. And this is a terrible thing for the health of children's literature and children's culture in Australia. And one of several things that's making it more difficult is that if you're, I'm hesitating, I'm not sure if I should tell you this. Look, I'm going to tell you this. A few years ago, and then perhaps they were talking about it at a conference because they all started doing it together, the major publishing houses decided to rationalise their holding of books in warehouses because they developed an algorithm where they could apply it to any stock of any title, and this algorithm would tell them the day in the next few months or the date in the future, the actual day when the cost of keeping those books in that warehouse per book would be more expensive than pulping them and reprinting them when they were needed for future backlist sales. And deep breath, everybody, try not to get dizzy. All the major publishers went through and rationalised their holdings. I discovered that Penguin Random House, who were not alone in this, were going to pulp only books from only two of my titles. One where they'd been over-enthusiastic, I think, or let me say fairly, perhaps the book wasn't quite good enough, and they had 3,000 copies that they were going to pulp. They were going to keep a few hundred on the shelf knowing that they could reprint. Fortunately, I heard about this, and fortunately, I have a healthy relationship with them where they want to keep me happy. So I said, I understand your problem, here's my address, please deliver those books to my place and I'll make sure they find good homes. But I know that all the big publishers pulped a lot of books to obey that algorithm. And that's, I guess I'm mentioning this because it's those of us perhaps on the outside of the publishing industry, you see the equation of authors working really hard, taking huge risks with their own time in terms of a business model, in terms of a return, and then hoping that those books will sell enough copies that. But there are quite a few other sort of forces. And the one last thing that I quickly want to say is that, of course, the monetary return is important because in all sorts of ways in our lives, you know, money equals time and money equals the capacity just to exist. But there is another currency as well where writers can be putting out much more than is coming in, and that is time itself, because if you have to do other things to pay your bills, then you are using time for writing that probably, in terms of a balanced life and a happy family life, would probably be better used doing the sorts of things that we tend to do when we don't have to work. And a huge number of writers, not just in this country, a huge number of writers are basically working incredibly long hours because they're doing something to earn the money, and then they're doing their writing, which hopefully will earn some extra money as well. And the rest of their life has been squeezed into what can sometimes be relationship jeopardizing, amounts. So, yeah.
And so that really, it seems like you're in a very fortunate position, thanks to that backlist that's still being read so much. How much of your royalties come from your new books compared to those books from the last 34 years of work?
Obviously, it varies in terms of what a new book might return in its first year. But look, I can say that generally, half my total income comes from book royalties, and about, in a typical year, about 70% of my book royalties come from backlist. And I should also add to that, because I sense some people have already started planning their first children's book. Of those 40 books, 41 books in my backlist, which represent about 70% of my annual royalties. 70% of that 70% comes from about 4 books out of the 40. And these are books that are being used in, well, most of my books are used in schools, but these 4 are books that have found their way onto the Year 7 and Year 8 reading lists in high schools, where every member of that year has to have a book. So it's so in other words, if those 4 books were not being used in those high schools, my total royalty income would be down, well, yes, work it out, because I'm terrible at maths, but it'd be a chunk.
We're writers.
They're not
chunk.
maths books that Morris writes.
That's right. Clearly not, yes.
Yeah, and so that's really interesting if we start thinking about it. So even for someone like you that sells so many copies, if you were relying purely on the front list, then already your royalty income would be much less. And you mentioned that about half of your income comes from royalties. Can we ask what makes up the rest?
So the other half, I would say about half of the remainder, well, about a quarter of my income is ELR, PLR, educational lending rights, public lending rights, and the last quarter is, about 20% of the total is public speaking, and then there's other little bits and pieces. I have a secret second life. I write a wine column for the Gourmet Traveller Wine magazine, which pays almost nothing, but they let me hang around their tasting sessions, sort of, licking the glasses after they've been tasted. Oh, actually, this is just between us, of course, because as a children's author, I am officially celibate and teetotal, which means that my 2 children are clearly the product of an amazing process that...
Immaculate conception.
Well, yes, that's right.
So for those of you who are not familiar with the public lending right, so that's the public lending right and the educational lending right, this is an initiative that we have in Australia whereby central government revenue pays for the use of books in public and educational libraries. And so it's decided by a statutory formula. It's completely working outside of copyright, so it doesn't matter who owns the copyright, and the money is shared between authors and publishers. And for lots of authors, that makes up a really significant component of their income. What have you found about the royalties versus public lending right income in the work you've been doing, Annabel?
Yeah, so, you were talking about the shelf life of a book, and Morris is obviously a real exception to this rule. And I heard Natasha Lester say at a book launch, and I thought it was really cynical, but it later turned out to be true, that a book has the average book has about the same shelf life as a tub of yogurt. And it is, in fact, when I looked at my data, I had earned 90% of my royalties in the first 2 months. 90% of my total royalties over however many years I got in the first 2 months after the book came out. And so for most authors, they might only have a book every few years. I mean, I'm a really slow worker. I only have a book come out every 4 years or so. And you only make your royalties, perhaps in that first 6 months after your book comes out, and then you get no money from that book. But PLR and ELR is the gift that keeps on giving. So as long as there are copies of your books in libraries, you get paid for them year after year. And it's just, what economy people call passive income. It's just like money for nothing. It's like, woo! And I think so...
It's money for that 4 years of work, Annabel, that you did writing the book.
Yeah.
Thank you, Rebecca.
Not for nothing. Feels like you did nothing because you already did it so long ago. So authors who have a good backlist, again, because it's cumulative, so you're getting a bit of money each year for each book you have. So, I mean, I talked to a children's author I'd never even heard of, so not Morris sort of status. And she said she'd earned $200,000 over a 10-year period from ELR and PLR. Now, $200,000 over a 10-year period is not a lot of money, but for a writer, it's actually a lot of money. And so I think for a lot of writers, after a certain point, when they've got a certain number of books, PLR and ELR payments will almost certainly exceed what they make from royalties.
And I've heard a lot of authors tell me the same thing. Juliet, in your experience, is that common?
Yeah, it is common, and we'll take credit. The ASA's barracked very loudly and strongly and got PLR in many years ago, and we're fighting at the moment to get it on e-books, because you only get it on print books at the moment, so the current fight is for digital and audio. I think in publishing generally, it's a risky business, because in every other area almost you can brand market, but in publishing every book is its own unique thing. So the risks are high, and backlist is the holy grail. And so if you have the backlist, as Morris is talking about, for things like ELR, PLR, and royalties, and recognition and presence on shelves and bookshops, all these things count. And as the pressure comes on the lists and it's harder to get published, it's harder to get publishers sticking with you, as again Morris said, over those years it takes. Not many people break through as the household name on the first book. And I know it happens and we remember them, but there's very few of them.
So today we're here talking about the realities of making a living as a writer, but I thought it would be some useful context if we also talk about the realities of making a living as a publisher, because for independent publishers in particular, that is extremely tricky in Australia. So I just wanted to break down the economics of that briefly so that we understand the environment that we're talking about. So like I said, a best-selling indie press title might shift 7,000 copies. So at a retail price of $30, it is going to become a maths class. We, after GST, have about $190,000 that's got to pay for everything. So like at first glance, that sounds like a lot, but if we break it down, we see 10% goes to the author, so 19,000. And if they've got an agent, then the author's slice goes down to about 16,000. So you see why authors are so reliant on other funding, things like the public lending rights and so on, because $16,000 to pay for a year or 4 years' work is not very far, not like very much. Then we've got another 17,000 or so that goes to the cost of actually printing the book. That part is not so expensive. But here we have the rub. A whopping 130,000 or so goes to distribution. So that's the bookseller's share, and yeah, there's some gasps and open mouths. The print publishing industry is insane. The economics of it are just bizarre. So about 68% of that retail price will go to distribution, actually getting the book out into the hands of the audience. And that leaves about $24,000 to pay for everything else. And so that means refunding booksellers for unsold copies, paying the publisher, the editor, the accounting and marketing teams, and just keeping the lights on. And so when we talk about it being difficult to make a living as a writer, and another thing I forgot to mention, publishing also has certain fixed costs that have to be met for every single book. And your 7,000 copy bestseller then also has to cross-subsidize all of those more common examples where it only sells 1,000 or 2,000 copies. Okay, so it's very, very tricky. There's not very much money there. So in looking for ways to improve the situation for authors, we're not going to be able to find that in Australia's independent presses, for example. So Juliet, question for you. Where should we be focusing our efforts in improving that bottom line for authors?
Look, I think it's hard to escape that for most authors, it's going to be a patchwork career, as we've talked about. The only thing that I would say is that we've got to remember when we talk about writers, we're often talking about quality fiction writers and quality children's authors. There are authors in areas of non-fiction, in areas of good children's non-fiction. There are areas of writing where the dynamics of this are actually different. Fiction is by far the riskiest area of publishing. Having said that, I think that certainly from the point of view of the author, I think it's really important to maximise every single opportunity that there is. And by that I mean, I think that a lot of authors need to really be as knowledgeable as they can. When it's very difficult when you first get that offer to publish and the contract is there and you want to sign it before it disappears like Mission Impossible and the whole thing's a dream. But reading it and understanding it is incredibly important, because that intellectual property that you created when you wrote your book is your asset. That's your livelihood. Now, a publisher is always going to want to, we call it the land grab, get as many rights as throughout the world in any format that anybody's ever thought of in perpetuity. And so the more that we're working very hard on looking at ways that authors can either, if you decide that you'll give the publisher a go on those rights, try and peg them by period of time and say, go for your life for 5 years, but if nothing's happened, I would like them back. Of some of the work that I know we'll get onto with Rebecca of reverting rights, if the book has died and nothing is happening, to get those rights back. Because there are more alternatives now. There are things you can do with those rights. Things like the move now to book to film and what is happening with the Netflixes of this world. And if those rights are hanging there, they're better in your possession. You may be able to update the book, rewrite it, reshape it, repackage it. So I think the knowledge is king is never more true, I think. And it is, I know it can be difficult when you're a creative person, you don't want to think about all of that. But I did a workshop through the ASA recently, and part of it was I went through royalty statements for attendees. They had sent me in their statements. And, I've been in publishing for 30 years. I know how to read a royalty statement. And I tell you, it took me a considerable amount of time to sit down and nut out these royalty statements. And I'm damn sure the authors had no more clue than I did. Now, it's part of the initiative that we're doing to try and get standardisation in royalty statements. But even things like that, as I said to the members who were there, I said, it's your pay slip. We do need to understand what it is saying. I'm not saying publishers are out to rort authors. Of course they're not. But mistakes are made. Very large and very expensive mistakes are made. And it's understanding where your income's coming from. And so it's taking every opportunity from every part of the process that you can.
The European Union recently created a new copyright directive that tries to take new measures to protect authors, and one of the things that it created as part of that was a requirement for transparency in royalty statements. So finally, in 2019, so authors are now entitled throughout the EU to statements that explain how their rights are being used, what kind of money is coming in from that, and what the author's due by way of remuneration. Is there a case for that kind of right for authors here in Australia?
Oh, absolutely. I think it would be wonderful if we could get it legislated. But I think as an industry, we could do a lot with protocols and agreements to at least get underway. Because things like in a contract, the publisher has the right to withhold some of the royalties for the first 2 accounting periods, because all books are sold on a sale or return basis. Now, there are average royalty rates, and you can kind of work out a reasonable amount. But in my view, a royalty statement, if you're having money withheld because of returns, you should know what the returns rate is. You should know how many books were put out and how many have come back and when they came back. Very few royalty statements contain that sort of information. And I think that clarity, and you just being able to sit down, I know that, you know, we're probably, the maths genie in the room are in a small minority, but actually sit down and work out the royalties. You know, we're doing a bit of a mediation with a member at the moment and trying to explain to the publisher that the royalties are just mathematically incorrect. They just aren't right. But I'm starting to look like the maths genius because I'm not able to get this across yet. But so the clearer that it is and the more information on that statement so that you know, which is back to the contracts of having what they call an audit clause, so that you have the right to go to the publisher and ask to look at all their accounting for your book and have it checked. And it's one of those boring things that people don't think about when they're signing the contract until you really need it if something isn't looking right.
One of the really concerning things that I've been hearing about recently, I've been speaking with lots of authors' agents, literary agents, as part of my research in this area, and what some of them have been telling me is that, you know, they're very experienced in the field. They can often tell when something's not quite right. They've negotiated contracts for their authors that do have these audit clauses. And sometimes they do audit the accounts and they find massive errors. And I'm talking about 6-figure errors against the author in some cases. But then what has been happening is that the publishers, in order to settle these disputes, have been requiring confidentiality clauses that prevent that from being openly talked about. And so that's really concerning to me because we've got relatively few authors in Australia who are represented by agents who are the most well-equipped to sniff these sorts of things out. And if it's not able to be discussed publicly, then there's no canary in the coal mine to let other authors know that there might be something to investigate here and something might be off. So I think that that's a really concerning practice as well, to force people to keep quiet where that kind of error has been made. And it suggests that there is nothing to see here, that there's no reason why we might need to finally, decades or even hundreds of years after we've been talking about these issues of problems in royalty statements, it suggests, well, there's no problem, but there really clearly is a problem, and perhaps there needs to be a bit more pressure on publishers to get their act together and provide statements that convey actual meaningful information.
I think as well, to some extent, there needs to be, at a more basic level, there needs to be more pressure on publishers from authors for authors to feel that they can ring their publisher and say, can you explain this statement to me? Because I don't understand it. And I think that can be one of the things that, you know, people always hope to be published by a big 5 publisher, but one of the things about being published by a small independent publisher is that you often have a more personal and direct relationship with them. So I was able to, you know, ring my publisher at Fremantle Press and say, I don't understand my royalty statement, can you explain it to me? And she talked me through it. And I think a lot of authors feel they're just so grateful to be published at all. They don't want to kick up a stink or be difficult or demanding, and they wouldn't even feel that it would be okay for them to ring their publisher and ask them to explain something. So not even at the level of querying, are these numbers right, but even just saying, can you explain why is this a different rate to this? You know, just those most basic questions, we often don't feel empowered to ask them.
Which really says something about the power imbalance that we're working with here. We've had some terrific questions come through on the Twitters. So I want to give you one from Emily Paul, who's asked, if authors only make 10% of the cover price on their books, what does that mean when books are heavily discounted on websites like Book Depository? But can I add a bit as well? And in places like Big W and Kmart is the bit I'm going to add to that. Juliet, do you want to?
Well, this is another thing you need to do very carefully when you're reading your contract, is what your royalty percentage is a percentage of. Because if it's a percentage of the retail price, then you are to some extent protected from the discounting because it's based on the retail. If you've got a percentage of net receipts, that's a percentage of what the publisher has got for the book. And so obviously the publisher gets less if they've given the retailer more. So you have to be very careful of that to begin with. And the other part is, it's called the high discount clause. So there will be a trip point. All booksellers buy discount off retail. So there'll be a discount set when that royalty drops from a 10% of retail, say, to a 10% of net. You want that discount to be as high as you can possibly push it. Because those big retailers or wholesalers are getting high discounts. They buy big volumes, it's a commercial reality, but you don't want a high discount kicking in at 50%.
And another one that I'll just mention from Twitter, we had Terry Ann White from UWA Press chiming in saying she wishes that there was a publisher on this panel because it is a collaborative business, which I think we all wholeheartedly agree with. We did ask a publisher to come on the panel and they didn't feel comfortable speaking about the issue of making a living as a writer in Australia.
I'm a semi-publisher.
But of course, that is a really, really important point. And as I said, when I went through the economics of being an independent press in Australia, it is extremely depressing. There's a lot of businesses and a lot of presses, in fact, that rely on being attached to a university or having some other support other than the actual money that people pay for books, because we're such a small market that there just isn't enough money to go around. And yet it's Australia's independent presses that do so much of the heavy lifting in ensuring that our stories get told. And so that's another really important piece of the puzzle. The other money that comes from things other than the copyright, other than the book sales. And by that, I'm talking about things like fellowships and grants and so on. Another really concerning thing that's come out of the UK recently is what's happened to grant and fellowship income there. Because again, in 2006, I think the median income for UK writers from grants was almost £4,000. And in the 2018 survey, guess how much it was?
1,000.
£0.
Okay.
So it went from a median of almost £4,000 to a median of 0, which means more than half of authors, or at least half of authors, were not earning anything from that at all. Now, that's not the situation we've got here. Perhaps the panel might tell us.
Far off it.
Yeah, so I mean, the cuts to funding.
Austerity has hit really hard over in the UK. But what are the role of that kind of money that's outside the funding what's the role of funding that doesn't come from book sales? So we've got some really great initiatives here in Australia, like creative writing PhDs. We've got cultural funding and things like that. How important are these to authors being able to tell the Australian stories?
Oh, I mean, essential. I feel like without the grants that I've had, my books just wouldn't have made it into the world. And what's really frustrating is that, you see that pool of money getting smaller and smaller. So when I first started applying for grants, I had quite a high success rate. And recently, I've had the last 5 grants I applied for unsuccessful. So, if you're not supported by a grant, then you're constantly trying to scrabble for other work, and then you don't have time to do the writing, and then when you do apply for a grant, you haven't had a book for a long time, so you don't look like a good investment, and so you don't get that grant, and it's a kind of vicious cycle. But I mean, it's just when you're trying to fit your writing in around the edges of everything else that you're doing, like Morris was talking about, and also family life is compromised by that and those kind of things. So, but also you just never get that momentum. Sometimes you need that concentrated focus time where you can stay in the world of your book and keep thinking about it, not do it for 20 minutes here and then 3 days later do it for half an hour. You want to be able to do it for 5 days in a row and just think about it. And it's almost impossible without that kind of funding, and it's just getting harder and harder to get.
Yeah, I have to say I think the funding is a real issue. I mean, in terms of the federal-based funding, literature gets 6% of their discretionary funding. It is less than half of any other art form. And I think it's one of the things that we're trying to do, and I'd love everybody to be doing in this room, to some extent is reclaiming the importance of the real writer. And I'm not having any go at anybody on the programming for here, but this idea that everybody has a book in them has been of great disservice to the writers of our community and every other, because everybody does not have a book in them any more than they've got a violin concerto in them. They may have a story, and their story is valid, and they can tell their story to their family, and they can record it, but they don't have a book. It is a particular and wonderful skill that people perfect over years, and we would claim that literature lies at the heart of most art form, because art form is telling stories, be it music or art or dance, and that it should be the one most neglected, I think, is an indictment. So I would like to ban the idea, I say, that there is a book in every one of you, because I don't want to read the book of every one of you. I am sorry. And I think that it does have a subtle devaluing of what our true writers are doing. And I think it's important we start to reverse that trend, because it is getting a very crowded place there, because as Maurice said before, it's not, a lot of these costs have come right down. You couldn't just go off and make a book before. You needed the expertise of a publisher. Now you still need the expertise of a publisher actually, but you can technically make a book very easily. But that doesn't mean to say it's a good book. It doesn't mean to say it's got an audience. So I talk to the publishers about this a lot too, because I think they need to express better as a group the value that they are adding, because it is immense. And I haven't ever met an author who, well, no, one or two, but on the whole, most people would love to have a good publisher supporting and looking after their book. But a lot of people think a publisher prints it, and they don't. And as Terry Ann said, it's a collaboration, and I think we just need to reclaim some of this ground. I think it is being a bit eroded at a high cost.
And while we're speaking about other sources of funding, there is another taboo issue that people don't tend to speak about very much. And that is, while we see that most writers earn very little from the writing, we also see that they tend to come from households with a relatively high earnings. And what that tells us is that very often, in order to write, people are subsidized by a partner or by parents who have a much higher income. And of course, that influences the stories that get to be told and the voices that we get to hear. Maurice, can you tell us, you've been in this writing landscape for more than 3 decades. Given these trends that you're hearing about, does this concern you about the future of getting Australian stories told?
It does, but not terminally, because most people don't write for the money. The money is what enables them to have more time in the day to write, more equilibrium and balance in their lives between work and non-work. But the stories that are often the ones that most need to be told, that are most compelling to read, are stories that find their way out anyway. Now that certainly shouldn't be the end of the discussion, of course. And it is very hard to answer a question like this in a generalised way, because there are so many ever-moving components to the whole thing. I think in movies, your potential for fame and wealth from your creative activity is called blue sky. And there is perhaps a bigger gulf between the amount of blue sky that the average writer has compared to the maximum possible in this industry, perhaps, than in most creative industries. And that can be an exciting thing, and it can be a reason for anxiety and depression. Whenever a writer sits down with a need and a desire to write a book, let's say a story, because those are the sort of books I'm familiar with, regardless of who you are, regardless of what track record you've got, how widely you're already known, it may be the first time you've ever written chapter 1 and embarked. And nobody in the world but you knows that you've just written the first 2 words of a story. And there is huge blue sky potential there. Even if you have managed to occupy a creative space uncomplicated, unpolluted, some might say, with any direct awareness of the sorts of books that are selling lots at the moment. This is just you and your characters and your story. What you will do over the next months or years could result in an unchanging continuation of your obscurity, and at the other end of a very long spectrum, it could turn you into, as it did, a certain high-level corporate executive personal assistant in Scotland who sat down one day, legend has it, in a cafe because she couldn't afford to heat her tiny flat, and wrote chapter 1 of the first of what she'd already planned would be 7 novels about a boy who goes to wizard school. And at the end of that process for her, not in fact at the end of writing the first book, but by the time the 3rd book had published, she'd become one of the highest earning creative artists the world has ever seen. She was a household name. She'd brought into her life a whole range of problems that she would never have foreseen. Just the trucks backing up each night with the money. I mean, she can't open her front door some mornings, the poor dear. But so I guess I'm saying this because I think there are some fascinating ideas and avenues of inquiry looking at the big dynamics, the paradigms in which our creative work is done. And because there is always this potential of life-changing results of just one little book, and yes, we know that the probability is that it's not going to happen because only 1 in whatever, but the possibility is always there. And to what extent does that affect what any individual will write? The probability that it will remain largely unread, how does that affect what people write? When one is able to have that precious time to put all else aside in one's working week and just write a book because of a grant or a fellowship or generosity from a family member or one's discovery that one can in fact live on water and birdseed.
2-minute noodles.
Yeah. 2-minute noodles, luxury is what some writers would say. But there are all these different purely economic and components, and probably our culture, certainly our literary culture, is shaped in all sorts of ways, not ways that can be easily summed up, but the notion of I don't do it for the money, is only part of a much more complex relationship between authors and money, because the absence of the money or the presence of the money is having all sorts of effects, in unique perhaps to different writers, but always there in some shape or form. And we'd need another 27.5 hours up here to really fully explore this. But I think it's worth saying, because sometimes we've been talking quite a lot about the economics of writing, and it started to feel to me as though it's a little bit in isolation from the fact that this is not a pure process that will occur in exactly the same way, just as long as in any circumstances we can sit at that keyboard or at that writing pad and do it. So many other factors are becoming almost the co-authors of our books.
I think, do you mind if I just, from personal experience, so I have until recently been married, and my husband was the main breadwinner, and I was able to survive on bits and pieces and just do a little bit of work and get grants here and there. Well, since my separation from my husband, which is about 9 months ago, I have written less, substantially less, probably 80% less than I did in the year before that, because now I have the necessity to be working all the time to earn money. But as Morris said, I think if you really have a story that you want to tell, and if you aren't happy unless you're writing, you do still find a way to do it. But I think that it slows you down enormously, and it's also incredibly dispiriting. So to feel that you kind of just feel sometimes like you're never getting anywhere, and that magical moment where you write the end, it just keeps getting further away. And so it's a psychological thing too, where you don't feel like you're making any progress. And sometimes, I have had moments where I've thought, I can't bear this. I can't bear this world where I'm judged by how much money I make, and I constantly have to compete for grants, and when I'm unsuccessful, I feel that my work isn't valued, and sometimes it feels almost too, it sounds like I'm being melodramatic, but it feels like, can I go on with this thing that is often so unrewarding and harsh?
Yeah. Well, we've definitely taken some of the varnish off making a living as a writer in Australia. Let me just change angle a little bit. So, Juliet, you mentioned that the advice you like to give now is, yes, if you can, give publishers the rights for 5 years. But it's really not very realistic for most traditional publishing contracts, is it? So that most publishers in Australia and around the world will require rights for the entire term of the copyright.
Certainly the big ones will.
Certainly the big ones. And some wriggle room. I was speaking to Caroline Wood from Margaret River Press last night, and she was saying they only take rights for 5 years, which I think is hugely encouraging. But for the majors, and so my research team, for example, recently did a study looking into the archive of the Australian Society of Authors, for example, and we looked at what rights were taken by publishers, and most contracts were for the entire term of copyright, worldwide and for all languages. So there were lots of contracts that had all three of those characteristics. And so it's really interesting to think about then what are the circumstances in which authors can get those rights back. So that's what Juliet was talking about before when she mentioned reversion. So authors hand over their rights in exchange for publication as part of that collaboration with publishers. And then their contracts provide for the rights, they usually provide for the rights to be given back in some circumstances. So if the work goes out of print. Now, we've also seen in that research that a lot of the contracts are really unsatisfactory. So the contracts might be missing a clause about out of print, and certainly most of them are missing clauses that say you can get those language rights back if they're not exploited, or the territory rights back if they're not exploited. And that's a stark contrast to some other countries where there are much more author protections in terms of reversion rights. In the United States, you can get your rights back after 35 years. So you can't be obliged to give it away for the life of the whole copyright. In Canada, authors' heirs get them 25 years after the author died, but 2 parliamentary committees have just recommended that the rights go back to authors after a flat 25 years. So what do you think, Juliet, is there a case for stronger reversion rights here in Australia?
Oh, look, definitely. And I think it is something that we would really like to see, because we're talking about the majority of cases. You know, if you are publishing for the long term with a publisher, then of course you're very happy to keep the relationship going and no problem. But I think that we certainly try and encourage people to negotiate for these, not necessarily getting a 25-year reversion in a negotiation, but certainly getting a termination clause. That means, because you obviously don't want an out-of-print termination clause now, because a book never goes out of print, because it's eternally available, because it's an e-book. You know, you need a
Sorry, Juliet, just to break in, but this has been dealt with, hasn't it? There's now a definition that that talks. Obviously, with an e-book, you can't talk about how many copies left in the warehouse, which was the old basis of the reversion. But now it's how many have you sold in the last 12 months?
Well, it should be.
If it drops below a certain number.
So your contracts, Morris, say that, and a few contracts say that. But this
there are
survey,
still many that don't.
None of mine had that definition.
That's right. So the analysis we did in the ASA's archive, we looked at contracts from 1960 all the way to 2014, and we were really interested in tracking how those out-of-print definitions evolved over time. And the shocking thing is how little they did. We were seeing the same form of words in 1960 as in 2014, and lots of them didn't have those objective criteria for working out when a book's out of print. And of course that fundamentally changes the bargain between authors and publishers, because it used to be that the publisher would have to genuinely invest, like in a new print run, and really back the author's book in order to hold on to the rights, whereas now all they've got to do is bung it up on Amazon and have it technically available as an ebook or print on demand. But of course, you know, we're in such a different paradigm now that we do have things like print on demand and ebooks. There's this astonishing story to me about when Mark Twain went in to give testimony to Congress in 1906 in favour of longer copyrights. Like back then, copyright only lasted for 42 years. And his testimony to make it longer wasn't based on the value of books, but their utter lack of value. He said there's barely one book in 1,000 that's actually still worth reading after 42 years. And so what happens is the valueless books stop being available, and the valuable ones continue being available, and the only thing that changes if you make copyright longer is whether the author still gets paid, right? So he said, well, since they're all worthless anyway, they're lost, then there's no harm in making copyright, you know, infinitely long. But we can see how much that equation has changed today. Suddenly there is harm in giving long copyrights to everything because there's so many more options for authors now to exploit them where it's no longer commercially interesting to the publisher, isn't there?
Yes. I mean, and there will be more opportunities coming along. That when I look at what's happening with audio, I mean, 20 years ago, audio was starting to get real momentum in the US, but you just couldn't give an audio book away. And in recent times, that's a real growth area here. Now, of course, good publishers are exploiting those rights, but if nothing is happening, the rights are better. If things have come to a stop, the rights, in our view, are better off with the author than just sitting in the publisher vault, because you're one of many there, whereas if they're back with you, there are options, and there may be options in the future that you can do something with the rights. So it is an important principle, and many of the things that I'm talking about, publishers will, you know, they will negotiate. I know that we do a lot of assessments of contracts, and we know that everything we recommend the author isn't able to negotiate. But it is a two-way negotiation. I think what you were saying, Annabel, of that fear of asking, if you've got a good publisher, they will never mind you asking. They will never mind you seeking advice. If a publisher says to you, if you don't sign within 12 hours, there won't be a contract, I can tell you now they're a crook. I've never had a good, proper publisher put that sort of pressure on an author. So engage in it and talk to them, because you can get to a reasonable resolution usually.
I've just got one more question for Morris before we move over to the floor for questions. So do have a think about if you do have a question. And my practice is always to take the first question from a woman, because the research tells us that if a woman asks the first question, then more women are willing to ask questions. There we go, we've got a volunteer for the first question. Whereas if a man asks the first question, we have less engagement from women. So no, not yet. Hold your fire. One more question for Morris.
We're running a bit out of time.
Oh, there's no more time. Where was the 10-minute warning?
Oh, there.
Oh, behind that. Did you guys see that and you didn't tell me?
I can't see it.
With no more time. Like no time for questions at all. I'm so sorry, but from my perspective, that is exactly behind the speaker box.
Yes, I saw it, but as those numbers counted down, I thought it was a live.
All right, but just very quickly to finish though, the last question is for Morris then. So we've heard a lot, we've taken the varnish off, we've pulled back the curtain, we've heard good things and bad things. Morris, a lot of the kids that you've written for and they've read your books over the years are now at the point where they're grown up and they might be thinking about a career as a writer themselves. What advice would you give them?
Do you want to let people know they can ask us a question?
Go for it, because even if it turns out that you're going to have to earn your bread and butter elsewhere, your life will be infinitely richer. You will have a permanent area of injustice in your life to rail against. Crucial for every creative artist, I think, as a daily touchstone. And we've been, for the last 20, 30 years, we've been in transition from some old publishing to new forms of publishing. And we haven't got the new opportunity sorted out yet. The distribution, the publicity, that people should know what you've written and know how to get their eyes on it. That's always been a huge part of the equation. It still is. There are solutions there still to be found. Actually, using the internet to find a readership is much simpler than, and I swore to myself 5 years ago that I'd never use this word on stage, but I'm going to do it. Easier than finding a way to monetize the process. But we're a creative bunch, writers, and the young people that I write for, and I spend time listening to tens of thousands of them each year, and they are no less creative than any generation that's come before them. And I think they're up for the task. I think in 20 or 30 years, Australian stories will still be being created and as appreciated as they are now. And the young writers who are creating the literary forms of them will have contributed to a continuing evolution in how we share stories, how those of us who think stories deserve some monetary return, through which channels those monetary returns are made. I'm optimistic in this area because there is no other choice than to be optimistic, because the world is falling into the hands of people who have the potential to do it terrible harm, and one of our weapons is stories. So we've all got to make sure that not just the creative space is available to our next generation, but the economic infrastructure that's going to make it possible for them to tell the stories to hold the bastards at bay.
Well, I'm so sorry that we've run out of time. We don't have time to ask Annabel to show us her feet. But do check out her blog at annabelsmith.com for more truth on making a living as a writer. You can get copies of her wonderful Whiskey Charlie Foxtrot in the shop here, and I believe they're discounted this weekend. It is marvellous. You can go to Writing WA for a pack she's put together about the realities of making a living as a writer. You can go to asauthors.org for information about the Australian Society of Authors and the work that they do. You can read about the work that my research team is doing at authorsinterest.org, or follow us at authorsinterest or at arguably on Twitter. And Morris will be doing a book signing in the foyer of the Library Theatre, so make sure you've got your copies to be signed there. And since I've been so negligent, for those of us who are still available for a few minutes afterwards, we'll be out there if you do want to ask us some questions, starting with this lady here at the front. So thanks for joining us. Up next is Dr. Carl coming to explore what is truth, which you probably don't want to miss. Keep your seat if that's the case, because I think it's going to be pretty packed. And the session will also be live streamed in the Cultural Centre, which you can watch it out there too. Thank you so much for coming.